Margaret Chen had been staring at the broken fence for 3 weeks. Every morning, she would stand at her kitchen window with her coffee, looking at the damaged wooden panels that separated her backyard from the Hendersons next door. The storm in late September had knocked down nearly 20 feet of fencing, leaving her small garden exposed, and her elderly dog, Buster, with an easy escape route he had already used twice. At 62, Margaret found herself facing challenges she never expected when Robert died 2 years ago. Her late husband had always handled the house repairs, the yard work, the heavy lifting that came with homeownership. Now, living alone in the 3-bedroom ranch house they had shared for 35 years, every broken thing felt like a mountain to climb. She had called 3 different contractors about the fence. The first one never showed up for the appointment. The second quoted her a price that made her laugh out loud, though not from humor. The third seemed more interested in selling her a complete yard renovation than fixing 20 feet of wooden fence. Margaret was a retired elementary school teacher, living on a modest pension and Social Security. She had taught 2nd grade for 40 years, watching thousands of children learn to read, helping them through scraped knees and hurt feelings. She knew how to stretch a dollar, how to make do and mend, but some things required skills and strength she simply didn't possess. That Thursday morning in October, she noticed a man working in the Hendersons' backyard. The Hendersons, Jim and Carol, were snowbirds who had left for Arizona the week before. They always hired someone to check on their house during the winter months. But this man was doing more than checking. He was actually working, fixing a loose board on their deck, clearing fallen branches from their patio. Margaret watched him work for nearly an hour. He moved with the steady confidence of someone who knew his way around tools and outdoor work. He looked to be in his mid-50s, wearing a faded denim shirt and work boots that had seen plenty of use. His hair was more gray than brown, and he had the patient way of working that came from years of experience. When he finished with the deck board, he started gathering the fallen branches into neat piles. That's when Margaret noticed him looking at her broken fence. He stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, studying the damage like he was working out a puzzle in his mind. Margaret made a decision that surprised even her. She walked outside. "Excuse me," she called over the intact portion of the fence. "Are you the person the Hendersons hired to look after their place?" The man looked up and smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I'm David Miller. I do property maintenance and repairs around the neighborhood. The Hendersons asked me to keep an eye on things while they're away. I'm Margaret Chen," she said, walking closer to the fence line. "I live here year-round. That storm last month did quite a number on my fence." David walked over to examine the damage more closely. He ran his hand along one of the broken posts, checked where the panels had pulled away from their supports. "This is definitely fixable," he said. "Most of the posts are still solid. You'd need maybe 4 new panels and some hardware, but the foundation is good." "I've been trying to find someone reliable to fix it," Margaret said. "So far, no luck." David was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence, then at Margaret. "I could take care of this for you," he said. "I've got time this weekend, and it's really not a complicated repair. Would save you from having to deal with the big contractors." Margaret felt a flutter of relief mixed with caution. She had learned to be careful about who she trusted with work around the house. Too many stories from her teacher friends about contractors who took advantage of women living alone. "What would something like this cost?" she asked. David walked along the damaged section, mentally calculating. "Materials would run you maybe $250. For the labor? How about another $150, $400 total, and I guarantee the work." Margaret almost laughed with relief. The last quote she had received was for nearly $1,500. "When could you start?" she asked. "Saturday morning, if that works for you. I'll pick up the materials Friday after work." They talked for a few more minutes about the details. David explained exactly what he would do, what materials he would buy, how long it should take. He answered her questions patiently, never making her feel foolish for asking. When she mentioned that Buster had already escaped twice through the gap, David suggested adding a temporary barrier until he could make the permanent repair. "I'll bring some chicken wire tomorrow and tack it up," he said. "That'll keep your dog safe until Saturday." True to his word, David showed up Friday evening with a roll of chicken wire and some steaks. He spent 20 minutes creating a temporary fence that would keep Buster contained. He refused Margaret's offer of payment for this extra work. "It's just being neighborly," he said. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear. Margaret had been up early, unusually nervous about having a stranger working in her backyard all day. She had coffee ready and had even baked muffins, though she couldn't quite explain why. David arrived at 8 o'clock sharp with his truck full of materials and tools. He had kept his word about everything, down to the specific type of stain he said would best match her existing fence. "I brought my own lunch," he told Margaret when she offered coffee. "But I'd love a cup of that coffee, if you don't mind." As David worked, Margaret found herself checking on his progress more often than necessary. From her kitchen window, she could see him measuring carefully, cutting each board with precision, taking his time to get everything exactly right. This was not a man who rushed through his work or cut corners. Around noon, Margaret brought him a sandwich and another cup of coffee. David had made impressive progress, and the new section was already taking shape. "You really know what you're doing," Margaret said. 40 years of construction work teaches you a thing or two," David replied. "Started right out of high school. Worked my way up from carrying lumber to running my own crew. These days I prefer smaller jobs like this. More personal, less stress." They talked while David ate his lunch. Margaret learned that David was 56, recently retired from a large construction company, divorced for 8 years. He had 2 adult children who lived in other states, and 3 grandchildren he saw a few times a year. The property maintenance work kept him busy and gave him spending money for his hobbies. "What kind of hobbies?" Margaret asked. "I restore old furniture in my garage," David said. "Find pieces at estate sales and yard sales, bring them back to life. It's satisfying work, seeing something beautiful emerge from something that looked hopeless." Margaret thought about her own house, full of furniture that Robert had always meant to refinish but never found time for. After he died, she had been overwhelmed by all the projects he had left undone, all the things that needed attention. David worked until nearly 5 o'clock, stopping only for lunch and a few short breaks. By the end of the day, Margaret's fence was not just repaired but looked better than it had in years. The new panels matched perfectly, and David had even touched up some old spots where the stain had faded. "It looks wonderful," Margaret said as they walked along the completed fence line. "Better than I hoped." David was packing up his tools, looking satisfied with the day's work. "Should last you another 15 or 20 years, he said. "And if you ever have any problems with it, just give me a call." Margaret paid him the agreed-upon amount, plus an extra $50 that David initially tried to refuse. "You earned every penny," she insisted. "And you gave me back my peace of mind." As David loaded his truck, Margaret realized she didn't want him to leave. For the first time in months, she had spent a day with someone who listened to her, treated her with respect, and delivered exactly what he promised. "David," she called as he was getting into his truck. "Would you like to come in for dinner? I made a pot roast, and there's way too much for just me." David paused, his hand on the truck door. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Chen. But I don't want to impose." "You wouldn't be imposing," Margaret said. "I'd enjoy the company." David smiled that genuine smile again. "In that case, I'd be delighted to stay for dinner." Dinner that Saturday evening stretched into 3 hours. Margaret hadn't talked to another adult for so long in months, and David seemed genuinely interested in everything she had to say. They talked about her years teaching, his construction projects, their children, their deceased spouses. Margaret found herself sharing stories about Robert she hadn't told anyone, and David spoke openly about his ex-wife and the loneliness that had settled into his life after the divorce. Over the following weeks, David found reasons to check on Margaret's fence. First, he wanted to make sure the new stain was curing properly. Then he noticed one of the gate hinges needed oil. Each visit led to coffee on Margaret's back porch and conversations that grew longer each time. Margaret started looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. David had a way of making her feel interesting again, worth listening to. He asked about her students, her garden, her opinions on everything from local politics to the best way to make apple pie. When she mentioned that her porch steps were getting wobbly, David showed up the next weekend with his tools. "I was going to call someone about those steps," Margaret said as David examined the loose boards. "No need," David replied. "This is maybe an hour's work, and I've got time." The steps led to another dinner invitation, which led to David helping Margaret clean out her garage, which led to him fixing her leaky kitchen faucet. Neither of them acknowledged what was really happening, but Margaret's neighbors began to notice a truck in her driveway most weekends. In November, Margaret invited David to join her for Thanksgiving dinner. Her daughter Linda was flying in from Seattle with her family, and Margaret was nervous about cooking for 5 people after 2 years of cooking only for herself. "I could use an extra pair of hands," she told David. "And Linda's been asking to meet you." David hesitated. Meeting Margaret's family felt like crossing a line they hadn't yet discussed. "Are you sure that's appropriate?" he asked. "I mean, what will they think about some stranger joining Thanksgiving?" "You're not a stranger," Margaret said firmly. "You're my friend. And friends are always welcome at Thanksgiving." The dinner went beautifully. Linda liked David immediately, and her children, ages 8 and 10, were fascinated by his stories about building houses and fixing things. David helped with the dishes afterward and even fixed the garbage disposal, which had been making strange noises for weeks. After Linda's family left, Margaret and David sat on her living room couch, full of turkey and contentment. "Thank you for including me today," David said. "I haven't had a real Thanksgiving in years." "Thank you for being here," Margaret replied. "I wasn't sure I could handle hosting again. But having you here made it easy." They were sitting close enough that Margaret could smell David's cologne, a clean, woodsy scent that reminded her of her father's workshop. The house felt different with David in it, more alive somehow, more like a home and less like a place where she was just waiting for time to pass. December brought more reasons for David to visit. Margaret's furnace started making odd sounds, and David spent an afternoon getting it running smoothly. Her Christmas lights hadn't worked since Robert died, and David untangled the mess of wires and got them twinkling again. Margaret began to realize that David was becoming essential to her daily happiness. She looked forward to his phone calls, treasured their dinners together, felt disappointed when work kept him away for several days. When Linda called to ask if Margaret was seeing someone, Margaret found herself unsure how to answer. "We're friends," she told her daughter. "Good friends." "Mom, friends don't come over 3 times a week to fix things that aren't broken," Linda said gently. "And they don't look at each other the way you and David look at each other." The truth was, Margaret was terrified. She had loved Robert deeply, completely, and losing him had nearly destroyed her. The idea of opening her heart again at 62 felt both wonderful and terrifying. What if David left? What if she wasn't brave enough to take the risk? The moment of truth came in early January. Margaret's fence had been holding up perfectly through the winter, but a section in her backyard gate had started to sag slightly. David came over on a cold Saturday morning to adjust it. Working in his heavy coat and work gloves, Margaret watched him from her kitchen window as he carefully realigned the gate, testing it several times to make sure it swung properly. She thought about all the Saturdays over the past 4 months, all the small problems David had solved, all the ways he had made her life easier and happier. But more than that, she thought about the way he listened to her stories, the way he made her laugh, the way he had brought life back into her quiet house. She thought about how much she looked forward to seeing him, how empty her days felt when he wasn't around, how safe and cared for she felt when he was there. Margaret realized with startling clarity that she was in love with David Miller. More than that, she realized she didn't want to waste time being scared about it. At 62, after losing Robert, after 2 years of loneliness, she understood that love was precious and rare. And when you found it, you needed to be brave enough to claim it. David finished adjusting the gate and was putting his tools back in their box when Margaret walked outside. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was clear. "David," she said, walking across the yard toward him. He looked up, smiling that familiar smile that had become so dear to her. "All fixed," he said. "Gate should work perfectly now." Margaret stopped a few feet away from him, looking directly into his eyes. She took a deep breath. knowing that what she was about to say would change everything. "Marry me," she said clearly, firmly. "I mean it." David's hands went still on his toolbox. His eyes widened, and Margaret could see the shock, the surprise, the questions racing through his mind. The January air was cold enough to see their breath, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Margaret," David said quietly, "are you serious?" "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Margaret replied. "I'm 62 years old, and I know what love feels like. I know what it's like to lose it. And I know how precious it is to find it again. I love you, David. I want to marry you." David set down his toolbox and took a step toward her. His face had gone through several expressions in the space of a few seconds: surprise, confusion, hope, and something that looked like joy. "You love me?" he asked. "I love you," Margaret confirmed. "I love your kindness, your humor, your gentle hands, your patient way of fixing things. I love the way you've brought life back into my world. I love you, and I want to spend whatever time I have left loving you properly." David closed the distance between them and took her gloved hands in his. "Margaret Chen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was too old for this kind of surprise." "Is that a yes?" Margaret asked, her own voice shaking slightly. David smiled, the biggest, most genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "That's a yes," he said. "That's absolutely a yes." The kiss that followed Margaret's proposal happened slowly, tentatively, like two people learning to trust again after years of protecting their hearts. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling and crying at the same time. "I can't believe you proposed to me," David said, still holding Margaret's hands. "I can't believe I waited this long," Margaret replied. "Robert always said I was too careful about taking risks. I think he would have liked seeing me be brave for once." They spent the rest of that Saturday afternoon sitting in Margaret's living room, talking about what marriage would mean, what they wanted from their remaining years together. David had been living in a small apartment across town since his divorce. Margaret owned her house outright, and it made sense for David to move in with her, but they talked through every detail carefully. "I don't want to erase Robert's memory," David said. "This was your home with him. Robert's memory isn't in the furniture or the walls," Margaret replied. "It's in my heart, and it always will be. But this house has been too quiet for too long. I want to fill it with life again, with our life." They decided on a spring wedding. Small and simple, in Margaret's backyard. Linda was thrilled when Margaret called to share the news, though she pretended to be shocked that her mother had done the proposing. "I raised you to go after what you want," Linda teased. "I just didn't know you'd learned that lesson so well." David's children, Michael and Sarah, were equally supportive when David called them. They had worried about their father's loneliness since the divorce, and hearing the happiness in his voice was answer enough to any questions they might have had. Planning a wedding at 62 was different from planning one at 25. Margaret and David focused on what mattered most to them: good food, close friends and family, and a celebration that reflected their gratitude for finding each other. They wrote their own vows, choosing words that acknowledged their previous marriages while promising a future built on the wisdom those experiences had given them. The wedding took place on a beautiful Saturday in May, exactly 1 year after David had first fixed Margaret's fence. Margaret wore a simple blue dress and carried a small bouquet of daisies from her garden. David wore a navy suit and the biggest smile anyone had ever seen on his face. Margaret's backyard was transformed, with white lights strung between the trees and small round tables covered in cheerful yellow tablecloths. 35 guests gathered to watch Margaret and David exchange vows under an archway David had built himself, decorated with flowers from Margaret's garden. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Margaret said during the ceremony, "to appreciate every ordinary day we're given together, and to never take for granted the gift of finding love twice in one lifetime. I promise to keep fixing whatever breaks in your world," David replied, "to listen to your stories, to make you laugh every day, and to love you with the wisdom that comes from understanding how precious and fragile happiness can be." The reception lasted well into the evening. Margaret's former teaching colleagues mixed easily with David's construction buddies. united in their affection for the happy couple. Linda gave a toast that made everyone cry, talking about how her father would have loved David and how proud he would have been to see Margaret choosing happiness again. David moved into Margaret's house the week after the wedding. They spent the summer merging their lives in ways both practical and profound. David's furniture joined Margaret's, and they found room for his workbench in the garage alongside Margaret's gardening supplies. Margaret learned to appreciate the sounds of David puttering around the house, fixing things that didn't really need fixing just because he enjoyed having projects. The first real challenge came in October. When Margaret was diagnosed with diabetes during a routine checkup, the news scared them both, bringing back memories of serious illnesses they had faced with their previous spouses. But David approached Margaret's health the same way he approached everything else, with patience, research, and determination to solve whatever problems came up. He learned to help Margaret monitor her blood sugar, adjusted his cooking to support her new diet, and walked with her every evening to help keep her numbers stable. When Margaret felt frustrated or worried about her diagnosis, David reminded her that they were a team now, and teams faced challenges together. "Remember when you proposed to me?" he said during one of Margaret's difficult days. "You said you wanted to spend whatever time you had left loving me properly. Well, that goes both ways. Whatever time we have, we'll make it count." Their second Christmas together brought all their children and grandchildren to Margaret's house. The noise and chaos of 5 grandchildren under one roof delighted them both. David had finished restoring an old rocking chair just in time for the youngest grandchild, and Margaret organized cookie decorating sessions that left the kitchen covered in frosting and the children covered in joy. The house that had been too quiet for 2 years was now filled with laughter, conversation, and the comfortable sounds of a life fully lived. Margaret's fence stood strong through another winter storm, and David's tools found new purposes almost every week as they made the house truly theirs. On a cold February evening, as they sat by the fireplace David had restored to working order, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if that storm hadn't knocked down my fence?" she asked. David considered this seriously, as he did all of Margaret's questions. "I think we would have found each other anyway," he said. "Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe it would have happened differently. But I think we were meant to end up here. Even if I hadn't been brave enough to propose?" David laughed, the sound warm and comfortable in the quiet room. "Especially then. You taught me that sometimes the best things happen when you stop waiting for the perfect moment and just take the leap." Margaret curled up closer to David on the couch, listening to his steady heartbeat, feeling grateful beyond words for the courage she had found that January day. She had learned that love doesn't follow schedules or wait for convenient moments. Sometimes it shows up disguised as a man fixing your fence, and sometimes it requires you to be brave enough to ask for what you want. Outside, the wind was picking up, but inside, everything was exactly as it should be. The fence stood strong. The house was warm, and 2 people who had thought their stories were ending had discovered they were really just beginning a new chapter together.